industry is heading, why we think it's important, and also some things that maybe we can all do to start heading in the right direction, or what we see is the right direction. So before we get started, it's worth pointing out we're not claiming to be experts in what we're talking today about. Instead, we're on a journey to try to discover ways of delivering more value more efficiently. So what we're going to be talking about today is a mixture of a whole bunch of research that we've done, as well as, I guess, the learnings that we have from the work that we do day to day, and a few ideas of our own thrown into the mix. Our hope is that the talk today will be thought-provoking.
This picture of a whiteboard that Rob and I used when we were coming up with ideas for this presentation. We just crammed it full of stuff which we felt passionate about at the time. And one of the things that was a recurring theme, and it's always actually a recurring theme whenever Rob and I talk, is this idea of common sense. It seems that sometimes, in our sort of day-to-day jobs, people and situations aren't always rational. We keep talking about Agile, we keep thinking about, books we read, presentations we see, and it all looks so simple. It's all common sense. And yet, for some reason, when you try and apply that in a business context, somehow it isn't. It's really, really difficult. There's lots of reasons for that, probably. There's business context, and I think there's a big, heavily part of sort of human behaviour that gets involved. Let me give you an example of that I came across just last week. A colleague of mine were working on a particular feature. Now, a company which we're currently working at, we use pull requests. I won't bore you with the detail, but if you're familiar with pull requests, what they allow you to do is they allow you to write some code, a new feature or something. When you're happy with that, you create a pull request, and your colleagues get noted that pull request is available, and you actually want to get that merged into the code base. A pull request is really cool because you can go in there and you can have a look at the differences between the code that you've written and the code that's currently you want to merge into. You can write comments and have a little chat. By the way, did you sort of realise you missed something over here, or maybe that requires a unit test, that sort of stuff. We had this one particular pull request that had been around for a little while, and we wanted to merge it in. We said, we need to get this pull request accepted in. We had a release going out that particular the next day. So we were sat there chatting on an instant messenger. We use HitChat from Atlassian, we used it for. And we were having this little chat saying, this is really, we need to get this in. Yeah, what about this? Yeah, no worries. And we were chatting away for 4 or 5 minutes. Eventually, we kind of got to a conclusion, and everything's good. And I sat back and I thought, hey, it's really good. We're using tools, and it's really nice. And then I kind of thought, well, what should we be doing? Because there's me sort of writing a sort of hit chat over here, and my colleague was probably around about here, writing it back to me. And I'm thinking, this is nuts. I mean, I could have written it down on a piece of paper and airplane thrown at me, just as efficient as me on HitChat. So sometimes we do things and it doesn't make sense, but we kind of get caught up in whatever it is, whether that's tooling or whether that's process or something. I'll give you another more relevant example. Let's take a typical project we see today. Maybe a new project starts and a new project team's assembled, and they might decide to take on a particular Agile methodology. Let's say, for argument's sake, they're going to use Scrum. So they assign a Scrum Master. They assign a product owner. They maybe sort of set up some recurring meetings in their Outlook diaries to do stuff. They sit down with the product owner and they build a backlog, and they think they're doing a pretty good job. But what you often find, and maybe you've experienced this, is that the guys, the teams, the members of the team aren't really getting the full value of Agile. What you tend to find is they're either missing bits, or they just think they know better, or they're following the process, they're following the mechanics, the rules of the process, of what they think they believe Scrum is, or the Agile process. We're kind of missing the value, missing the point of why we're doing it. We kind of have arguments about, the mechanics, the rules. You sort of sat in a sort of product backlog refining session for you these days, and you're arguing about whether you t-shirt sizing or points estimation. You get caught up in all the detail. And that really isn't common sense, you're actually missing the point of why we're actually doing this. I think it's fair to say, though, that the last 10 years or so, we've got much better as development teams in adopting these sort of practices. I think it would be harsh to say that we're still in, we're still suffering really, really bad. I think some really good cases where there's some teams, especially around Perth, who are actually probably, pretty good at what they do, high performing teams. And I think actually we should probably give a little bit of credit for some of the good hard work that's going on.
Yeah! Nice.
Time for us to record ourselves.
Yeah.
We can always applaud you, actually. Cool. So I completely agree. I think as an industry, we're getting a lot better at getting to this stage where we've got teams that really are thinking in an agile way and they're delivering a lot of value. But we go into quite a number of different organisations, and something that we often see is we see that the awesome work by the software development teams bookended by more traditional software management practices. So quite often we'll see project planning result in the scheduling of really large projects with large budgets. And quite often teams will be allowed to practice Agile as they see fit until they get closer to the end of the original plan where there's more pressure to deliver. And then things get worse as the teams kind of near the end of that original plan, because what we often see is that organisations are reluctant to do QA and release procedures until near the end of that original plan. So you haven't actually realised any value until sort of right near the end, because until it's in production, you're not actually realising any value from it. Often these projects will be considered finished when the team delivers the software to a separate operations team who are responsible for deploying, supporting and maintaining the application. Now, there's a couple of problems in particular that we see in these behaviours. The first is that it often forms a rift between the development teams and the operations teams. And this results in a whole raft of issues that essentially mean it's really hard to efficiently support and maintain the software. Now, this is one of the things that the DevOps movement aims to address. So this is kind of sounding familiar. It might be worth taking a look at that. But the second problem that we see is that a project is often considered successful if at its closure it's on time and on budget. But that's despite whether or not it actually met the original goals of the project. So put another way, how can you know that a project is successful unless you measure the outcome of real-world usage against real end users of the software? Now these behaviours that we're talking about here, they promote and they reward non-agile thinking, and they make it really hard for businesses to realise the true business and strategic value that their software teams could be delivering them. But it's not all doom and gloom, because what we're increasingly seeing is tools and techniques emerging that take away all of the kind of technical hurdles that we have to worry about with software and allow us to focus, or in particular our product owners, to focus on being more agile in the way that they prioritise and specify the software that they're responsible for. So let's look at some of these techniques. If we start from a technical point of view, everyone in the room should be pretty familiar with continuous integration and everyone should be practicing it, so I don't probably need to explain what it is. But what we get from continuous integration is we get a single source of truth of what the software is at any point in time, and importantly we get a reduced feedback loop for the development team on knowing if the software that they're writing is okay at any point in time. And I've already mentioned DevOps. So with DevOps we get all of the different parts of a business that are responsible for software in some way, be it the specification of it or the design and delivery, support, information security, change management. All of these different areas are being encouraged to collaborate together more closely and remove the traditional silos that you might see and reduce the feedback loops of that communication between all the different people that are involved. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that there are tools and techniques that are emerging that make it really easy for us to collect and analyze and respond to technical metrics that tell us that when we deploy our software, is it okay? Is it running okay? So all of these kind of technical things, what they mean in combination is that largely now, as an industry, we're very good at developing software and then delivering it to production and knowing that it's okay and being more proactive about responding when it's not. This is really cool because it means that as an industry, we kind of have to worry a bit less about the technical side of things, which allows us to focus more on the business side of things. And that's where I see techniques like continuous delivery come into play, which nicely kind of bridges the gap, I think, between technical and business. Now, continuous delivery, probably the term at least, was probably coined by Jess, and he wrote the book on it. And he describes continuous delivery in one sentence as reducing the cost, time, and risk of delivering incremental changes to users. So elaborating a little bit more on that, what we see with continuous delivery is that we're increasing confidence and repeatability by taking commits that developers make and pushing them through a largely automated and consistent pipeline to eventually get them into production. Now, continuous delivery, it must be noted, does imply cultural change. And cultural change, as we probably all know, we go through it day by day, a lot of us anyway, is hard, right? It takes time and effort. It involves cultural change for the development team, who now have to make sure that everything that they do, every commit that they make, is production ready, because the software could be deployed at any point in time. It implies cultural change for the product owners, who now have a much smaller release cadence, and they have to start thinking about what features am I going to get the team to do next, because the users are going to see them very soon, and how the users are going to react to that, and how do I communicate with the users, and how do I take advantage of this reduced feedback loop that I have with my users. And it implies cultural change for pretty much every other part of the business that deals with software. If you think about change management and information security and all of the operations teams, all of them are going to have a slightly different role and a slightly different interaction if you've got this kind of approach. So as I said, change management is hard, right? So, you might be thinking, well, it sounds like a lot of work, I'm not going to bother, what's the point? To understand what the point is, you need to look at the behaviours that this starts to elicit in particular in the business. The first one that always comes to mind for me is the fact that continuous delivery takes the decision about what goes to production and when, from being an IT decision to being a business decision. Now, once you've done that, and we've seen the effect of this firsthand, it kind of gives our product owners a confidence, it empowers them, and it gives them, and this is starting to get into a kind of a psychological thing, but it gives them almost an excitement about releasing changes to their users more often. And it empowers them to use production deployments as a cheap and easy way to learn something about the way in which their users are interacting with the software. And once you've done this, then you've empowered the product owner to be able to use techniques that kind of take advantage of this reduced feedback loop and allow them to be smarter about the way that they prioritize and design the features of the system. And I'll cover that in just a second. At the end of the day, what it means is we've allowed our product owners and our businesses to understand what makes their products great, rather than guessing when they're doing their prioritization and their design. Sorry, I just kind of touched on this, but once you're in that situation where you've got this really small feedback loop with your customers, it empowers you to start using some techniques like capturing and analyzing usage analytics about how the users are actually interacting with the system, using A/B testing to see the actual effect of a feature on user behavior, and feature toggles to decide at any point in time what features should a user see or not see, and controlling which users can see features and that kind of thing. Now, these techniques that I'm talking about here, it's not just idle theory. There are companies out there right now that are doing this day by day. Now, there are three in particular, almost poster companies for this that I come across regularly in my research. They've got a lot of case studies and presentations, and they're actively out in the community talking about it. In fact, from memory, the last Agile Perth one was Spotify, but the other two are Netflix and Etsy. This is an example from an Etsy slide deck where they're talking about using a feature toggle to see the effect that this particular feature has on business metrics that they're measuring, and then knowing, what effect is this going to have on my bottom line, and that kind of thing.
So this is looking pretty good. I must admit, I get quite excited by this sort of stuff. Some really good, interesting case studies, and I think a lot of people in development teams are now sort of starting to listen to this sort of advice and reach for the latest continuous deployment tool. They start having automated builds. They try and get their product owners involved as much as they can. And they really are starting to feel like they're starting to make a difference, and it really is proper agile. Or is it? Perhaps what's really happening is that we're just becoming really efficient at waste-producing machines. We have these deployment pipelines chucking out features. We're focusing on tools and efficiencies of the development teams, but in reality we really get the engagement from the business that we think we do. What I think part of the problem is that you go back to that high-performing team slide, you had that high-performing team in the middle, and you had these two sort of soggy slices of waffle bread. So you have this high-performing team sandwich, and the problem is sometimes I kind of feel that we're trying to eat our way out of the problem. Maybe a better way of showing this is maybe the influence of Agile within a typical organisation. What we often do is we often adopt these things as a development team. We have tight feedback loops, we practice iterative development of some sorts. We try and learn as we go, we learn the tooling, we learn about the problem space, the technologies. And we're now starting to push the business, sort of saying, hey look, this is really cool stuff, look what we can do for you. And the business might be listening to us, then sometimes I think they're just playing lip service, yeah, whatever, you feel that stuff, really good. But we're starting to have a little bit of influence. But what about this end? What about the end that actually probably is the most significant, which is the strategic end? What can we do? What lessons can we learn from what we're doing in the sort of technical space? And now starting to do the business space. What can we do from a strategic end? I think really what Rob and I sort of the conclusion we've come to is that the stuff up in the top left-hand corner is kind of a little bit pointless unless you sort this out. This is where the real value is. This is the stuff which should be driving the business, iterative business, discovery, doing A/B testing, doing all this really cool stuff. And it's the business that should be driving the technical implementation of a cool deployment pipeline, iterative development. It's all a little bit back to front. So what we need to do is we need to sort of think about the strategic side. We've got some question marks here. What can we do? What techniques can we do to try and enable us to be strategically agile? Maybe it just takes, you should step back a second and think about at the heart of Agile is usually some sort of empirical process, a scientific method that is all about coming up with an idea, forming some sort of experiment, doing that experiment, observing the results, and then confirming or disproving your idea and then moving on. Obviously Scrum, sprints and everything else, that's kind of tries to be empirical. So what can we do to apply that at strategic end? It happens that actually sort of strategic agile, strategic scientific thinking has actually been around for a little while. This is a quote that I came across recently. It's actually from a paper written in 1915. It said that if we allow our customers to be governed by opinion when it is possible to obtain facts, we shall lose in our competition with those who base their actions on facts. Anyone? Yes, who came up with that quote? A guy called Henry Lawrence Gantt. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see the word Gantt, shapes. Kind of sort of have visions of like these sort of blue, sort of horizontal lines that kind of represent sort of fixed scope, and you think these little black dots which represent fixed time, and you see a whole bunch of names, and you just go, oh god, fixed budget as well. Time hasn't been particularly kind to Henry. The same paper that actually this quote came from, he did a study at a sewing factory. What he did is he sat there and observed the workers go about producing garments. They go through and they do sewing, they do this repetitive work. What he did is he observed them, and he actually sat down and he measured their productivity. He sat down and he produced various charts and measured their production rates. And then what he would do is he would try and do one small thing and see if that change had an effect on the productivity of the factory, the sewing shop. What he'd do is he'd maybe sort of move a piece of equipment here, or he might sort of speak to someone and maybe get to do things in a slightly different order, and then he'd measure them, and he'd then come back and observe the results, and then come up with another idea. And eventually, over many, many iterations, he would actually come up and he realised that he could make a really quite significant improvement on the productivity. This was also a time when industry really felt that the only way to maximise profit was to drive down labour costs. Material costs are kind of fixed, it's only so much you can do them, but with labour costs you can push those down. But of course, Henry and also Frederick Taylor, who was also of the similar sort of movements, realised that actually that was demotivating and actually productivity would drop. And what he did in this particular study is he came up with a kind of average sort of productivity rate that a person could actually produce on a normal shift. And then he would add incentives, financial incentives. So who would start at 5%, 10%, 20%, 30%. And he got to a point where it's kind of optimal, which I think this particular study was around about 30%. But what was really interesting was, not only by financially incentivising, paying people a decent wage and giving them motivation, he also found that people, the best workers, the more productive workers, would actually help out the workers who were least productive and try and get them better. He also found that across the workforce, everyone was looking to improve the situation, everyone was looking to continuously improve, so they would themselves look for things to do. So Henry came up with this theory of task-based management, and it was all about standardised work practices, observing, doing the same thing many, many times, trying to tweak it, trying to optimise it, and then that became his task-based management theory. Of this particular study, he said that a little consideration will show that such a policy is only in accord with common sense, and that the policy insisting that a man shall do a thing when we do not know whether or not he can, is to say the least, not productive of the best results. Which is kind of ironic, really, when you think about his Gantt charts and modern project management theory, which we're all as software developers or in the software industry, we're encouraged never to write the same piece of code twice. So we don't do repetitive work. And yet all Gantt's work was all about repetitive work, task-based work, which was like his era, that was the industry he was in. So trying to use the tools out of context doesn't make sense, and yet we still seem to be doing it. So we know this has been around a little bit, trying to think at a sort of slightly higher level about things. Why aren't we being a little bit more common sense? Well, applying a bit more common sense. Well, maybe we look at a few behaviours we might see in business today. These are just three, there's loads more, probably. Tenacity is a really interesting behaviour. We always sort of put our business leaders and sort of label them as being tenacious, sticking by their guns. They're better than everyone else. They lead by instinct rather than by anything else. But in a kind of way, you kind of think, well, actually, that's not scientific at all. Leading by instinct, give someone facts, give them actual data to base decisions on. Well, is that being tenacious? And what I wonder is that maybe of all the business people in the world who've succeeded and have been labelled as being tenacious characters, how many of the millions of billions of tenacious people have failed? We just never hear that. Another kind of trait we have in business is we like to feel a little bit comfortable in our decisions. We like other people to kind of say, hey, I've tried this works, this is a really good way of doing it. And they'll say, hey, great, I'll do that as well because you're doing that. But once again, that's not really kind of common sense thinking, that's not necessarily scientific thinking. I think you can probably cast your eyes back at some techniques and ideas that have gone, in previous times we look back on that and think, maybe that wasn't such a great idea after all. So authority, not necessarily a bad thing, just saying be aware when you're making decisions in a business context and what's influencing that decision. Finally, conformity. Conformity is a really interesting one because we love conformity. We make millions, billions of dollars on trying to sell, social networking software and all this sort of stuff, which tends to try and tap into this idea that people like to follow trends. But we also like to follow trends in our industry. We love to do the latest stuff. We love to use the latest tool, and we often do it completely out of context. So next time, again, you make a decision about using something and using a new technique, just think, am I just doing this because someone else is doing it, or am I doing this because I can see the actual need?
So, what we're talking about here is absolutely cultural change. We're saying we should take more of a scientific thinking approach in the way that we manage our companies so that we can start to drive everything that our organisations do from that strategic level. We're talking about changing the way, the mindsets of everyone working in the company at every level, technical, business, strategic, to be more of that kind of scientific mindset, that kind of experimentation, making decisions based on actual, real, hard data. Now, I touched on this before, cultural change is hard, it takes a lot of effort, and certainly, this kind of cultural change, Jess and I often try to inspire it in the places that we go because we're obviously very passionate about it. But often we will obviously come across barriers because it is difficult to do. Now, there's kind of like a realization, I suppose, that we've had, and that is that in order to be able to pull off the kind of cultural change we're talking about in this presentation, have to have someone from the top of the food chain involved, actively involved in it and kind of pushing it. So, someone from executive management, someone like the CEO of the company. And there's kind of two reasons why that is, at least, that we think it is. The first is kind of common sense to us anyway. If you're trying to change the culture of an entire company from top to bottom, then it just makes sense that you have to have someone at the top in order to pull it off. You can't make a big change like that without buy-in from someone that's actually controlling things. And the second reason is that if you're trying to drive all of the decisions in a company from that strategic level, then it makes sense that you're going to have to include someone that is part of that strategic planning cycle that's making those decisions at that level, so that that can empower the fact that you're trying to drive everything else in the business from it. So again, someone from executive management, someone like the CEO. Another thing about cultural change, it's kind of cool, I suppose, for us in that we have a really nice example, quite a prominent example locally of this happening in a company. Because if you look at Bankwest, they come from a traditional banking culture and government-led banking culture at that. There's a lot of really awesome people that they've brought in right now, and they're trying to go through a cultural change to drive everything in their business from the value that they deliver to their customers. It's a really nice thing to aspire to, but the cool thing is that there's people around here that we can talk to that are in the trenches doing this day to day, and we can swap war stories with them and see what things they've tried that work and haven't worked and that kind of thing. The other thing about cultural change is that it's going to be different for every company. Because you're going to start from a different place. The culture of every company is different. So it's worth keeping in mind that what someone tries in one company that's successful might not work in another. Now, as I said at the start of the presentation, we're not experts in this. And in particular, with this section, we don't think this is a complete picture, but we've kind of got some ideas of things that, some of which we've tried, some of which we haven't yet, that we think will help in this kind of thinking and in starting this kind of movement. Now, some of you in the audience are probably familiar with Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Now, in Lean Startup, Eric introduces the concept of a build, measure, learn feedback loop. Where he's basically, and I should note, he's, for quite a lot of the book, he is kind of coming from that strategic context. So he's thinking about someone that's trying to start a new company and direct that company in the right way to lead to a successful company. He does also say that the techniques apply at a kind of a lower level or as part of an existing company as well, though. But anyway, build, measure, learn. So you start off with some sort of idea. I think there's a product that this would be really good, people would like it, that sort of thing. You build something, and from that you then deploy it to people and you measure the outcome of how they react to it. From that you're going to get some sort of data, and from that data you're going to learn something. And then that's going to feed into the next idea that you have, and you basically do this cycle again and again and again and again until you either decide that your idea doesn't have any legs and you should stop, or that you have a successful business. Now there's another thing that Eric introduces in Lean Startup, and that's the minimum viable product, or MVP. And he defines the MVP as the one iteration of the build, measure, learn feedback loop that maximizes the amount of validated learning that you get while minimizing the amount of time and effort that you kind of cycle through. Now, that's a very deliberately vague kind of description, right? But that's because Eric makes the point that how big your MVP is going to change depending on your situation. It could be hours or days, or it could be weeks or even months. And it's going to depend on what is it that you're trying to learn. What are your customers? Are you in an established company or a new company? There's all these different factors that are going to change, I suppose, what is practical to get around that loop as fast as you can while maximizing the amount of kind of valuable data that you get. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because Jess and I think that the minimum viable product fits in as the unit of, or should be, the unit of measurement of strategic planning. So if you cast your mind back to earlier in the presentation where we had high-performing agile team, waterfall sandwich, soggy sandwich, or something like that, it was a great one, I said that often we see scheduling of large projects with large budgets. So instead of doing that, as a result of strategic planning, if you're scheduling smaller MVPs, then the strategic planning has a reduced feedback loop on finding out how well the result of their strategic planning is going. So let me try to give you like a kind of contrived example to try to illustrate my point. So you've got a company, they've got a strategic goal to increase membership by 20% over a 6-month period of time. What they could do is they could say, oh yeah, we think this will do it, we're going to schedule a 6-month project, and then we'll see you guys later, right? And then at the end of that 6 months, either they've failed or they've succeeded. And there's only one opportunity for learning, and that's right at the end. Alternatively, what they could do is they could say, we think this thing here looks like it's going to be the best way to achieve this goal. Let's schedule our 1-month minimum viable product. We'll give a product owner on it, let them go off. He will work with the team. They'll deliver something to production. They'll measure the effect that it has, and then we can see how much has that contributed to our 20% goal. If it's doing really well, then you'll say, oh, awesome, this clearly has legs. Let's do the next bit and do another minimum viable product on that to see the effect that has. Or it's doing okay, but we're probably going to need to kind of tweak some stuff and do a bit of a pivot. Or alternatively, it could be it didn't do anything, or even worse, it made it worse. In which case you're going to be, well, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to do something else, right, the next most promising thing. So say, in the end, in that 6-month period of time, they scheduled 6 minimum viable products. That's 6 times the opportunity to learn, and at every single kind of point where you're taking that measurement and getting a learning, you've got an opportunity to steer away from a course of action that's going to lead to a lot of waste. So we think this is a really powerful kind of, way of starting off your strategic planning cycle. Now, whenever I introduce the concept of a minimum viable product to people, one thing that I often see is a natural hesitance to exclude something from a minimum viable product. Because quite often people are like, well, if I don't deploy with that feature, the users might not like it, and so it should be in there. Now, whilst I definitely think a pragmatic approach is required, sometimes there are going to be features that are really critical, and the last thing you want to do is to get a bad reputation and piss off your users. I think that this quote here is a really nice kind of default mindset to kind of start on when you're trying to create an MVP. And it's by Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, and he says that if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late. I really like that quote. I think it's really good.
Look at that again, actually, because I don't know about you, but I think you can just be a little careful. I imagine if you would say that quote and go back to your bosses tomorrow and say you need to start writing software that's going to embarrass us, I imagine it won't go down too well. So the thing is, there's a heavy amount of context in this particular statement that you need to be aware of. Otherwise, we could end up giving MVP a bad name. If we think about the types of projects which we might have in our organisation, or the types of projects we're working on, this end of the spectrum, you might be trying to break into a new market, a market that doesn't exist today, a really volatile, risky, high-risky piece of work that has got lots of risk, but also has lots of reward. And on this side of the scale, you've got sort of business as usual projects for pieces of software which are already established in the marketplace. You know the customers pretty well. Now, if you were going to apply this end of the spectrum, the chances are it won't go down too well. And I hear a lot of negativity about MVPs, about people saying, well, it's just people putting out rubbish. And yeah, if you've got a brand to protect, you've got to be a little bit careful. But at this end, it kind of makes a lot of sense, especially if you're starting a new company, you haven't got a lot to lose. You want to get in and get out as quickly as you possibly can. Eric Ries does talk about trying to use this in larger organisations as well. He says, well, look, to mitigate that risk slightly, what you could do is you could spin up a new brand or a new company just to try and target that marketplace. Therefore, you're not necessarily going to get affected if things go wrong. And it's this type of creative thinking that maybe makes the difference between a really successful companies and less successful companies. There are different types of MVPs that we can think about as well. Well, first of all, we can think about types of users. Another suggestion that Eric Ries makes is that in order to protect your, putting out sort of stuff which you're embarrassed about to your mainstream users, you can isolate them by some early adopters. He says that many industries, and he's probably right in some industries, that you can you have a set of users who love this sort of stuff, who know that it might be rough around the edges, but we love getting involved in that. I mean, developers do that all the time. We get involved in beats all the time because we love working with the latest and greatest. of that is you've got to be a little bit aware of the biases of those types of early adopters. They may not actually represent the real behaviours of the people you actually really consult with. The other types of MVP are, for example, smoke test is a great one. You've probably heard of that one by various people in the lean movement, where you don't actually deliver any, you don't write the actual feature, but you write a button that says, hey, there's a feature here, and you click on it, and you end up with a page saying, hey, leave your details, will let you know it's available. That, you can, I suppose you could, not stopping you doing that all the way down this end that you really want to. It's not as risky, although again, you have to be a little bit aware of the fact that you don't want to annoy your customers, take advantage of them. So use it sparingly, don't use it everywhere. So, and there's one other type of MVP, which is actually, I think, is actually really interesting, and that's the concierge MVP, which again, you might have heard of from the lean startup. It's basically where you have come up with an idea, you don't develop a piece of software to solve that idea, you put a human system in place. So this is really great when you just don't know if the market exists or not. So what you might do is, let's say for example, we want to connect businesses with business venue providers. So hotels and cafes and restaurants who have meeting rooms out the back. You have this idea that you can make loads of money in and around Perth doing that. So what you do, instead of writing software that allows businesses to search and venue providers to advertise their services, instead of doing that, you pick up the phone and you build some relationships with some local businesses, and you say, hey, I'll tell you what, next time you want a business venue, you give me a call, I'll do the legwork, I'll go and find all the guys in local around Perth that meet your requirement. If you want to go ahead, I'll go and book it for you, I'll sort out all the catering, and I'll make sure everything's sorted for you, and for that, you give me a little fee. The great thing about that is they're testing the market without writing any software at all. Once they've proven that you actually have a product that you can sell, then the problem becomes a matter of scale. How can we scale this idea? So how can we go from 3 or 4 companies in Perth to 100 companies in Australia? What's the scale problem? Obviously, you can't do that all the time. So you start thinking about the simplest thing you need to be able to scale up to 100. Maybe that's just a small part of the end system. You're growing the system. And I know people might think, well, that's just crazy. That's great for startups. But interestingly, I've been thinking about this recently. I've looked back on my past engagements, and I think, you know what, sometimes there's been 1 or 2 occasions, and I think that might work quite well. I'll probably be really embarrassed by suggesting it. But again, it's this type of thinking that differentiates companies that are really going to succeed and companies that aren't. So, I think hopefully what I'm trying to explain is that a good MVP, but implemented in a bad context, is just a bad MVP. It's going to fail because you just implemented it in the wrong way. There's other types of bad MVPs as well. To steal a phrase, I think about some bad MVPs being MVP butts. A bit like Scrum butt. An MVP but without the learning. And people love doing MVPs, but they often miss out that part, the learning part. An example would be a company says, so we're going to do an MVP, and they sit down and they define a bit of scope, and they really try and cut back on all the stuff they don't think they need, and keep a real critical set of features. And then they go and release to an internal set of customers for a bit of testing. And that's the MVP, that's it, it's done. We'll move on to the next bit. It's kind of like, well, unless those internal users are your paying customers, and they're actually going to validate whether MVP has been a success or not, what you're doing is you're just confirming your own hypothesis and not actually getting anything out of it at all. You need to actually release to real customers. The other bad MVP that, again, Eric talks about is sort of releasing to the market but giving away your product for free when your business goal, your whole model is about charging model. What's the point of giving stuff away for free when you intend to charge them later? Because they're very willing to use your product while it's free, but as soon as you start charging for it, they go again. So again, you haven't learned very much about your customers. So just be aware of this, because I'm conscious of the fact that I read a lot of stuff about negativity about MVPs. I think they're great. I think we just need to be a little bit clever about how we use them.
So, this technique's fairly old now. Most of the people have probably heard of it, but certainly I've been using it for quite a number of years to try to map out initial backlogs for projects. Use a story mapping, right? So I find it's really good in getting a whole heap of stakeholders in the room to get some sort of shared understanding and eliciting, I suppose, of potentially quite a complex application. And it's good at that because you can kind of group vertically by say system goal or high level user tasks or whatever kind of makes sense for the system. and you can order them horizontally by some sort of logical order, like maybe chronologically based on how a user interacts with the system, for instance. And what this means is you should be able to pull any stakeholder from the business in and do what's called walking the map, where you start from the top left and you kind of move your way across, and as you're going, because it's ordered in a logical way that makes sense to that person, they should be able to gain a really quick understanding of what's going on. Now, I found that this technique is really good at, I guess, leading people to tell you what is missing from a map, but also things that are incorrect. The other thing that user story mapping is good for is to do initial release planning, because you can actually order them vertically by priority, and then you kind of carve out swim lanes, and then they can form milestones or releases or whatever it is that you would like to do with it.
Yeah, so I think story mapping is an oldie, but it's a goodie, and I think it's getting steely these days. What I love about story mapping, actually, and Rob sort of touched on it, was the fact that it gets everyone in a room, it gets decision makers and the guys that actually want making the decisions in the room, because you're not necessarily talking about real nitty-gritty technical stuff. I think that's the real value in them. We also can maybe, Rob talked about release planning, but it's also quite a useful technique to try and identify MVPs. Again, it ties back into that. This is a really useful technique that I really think is brilliant. It's a technique called impact mapping. I don't know if you come across it. If you have, great. There's a guy called Agile has written a little book called Impact Mapping. It's a small book. We recommend it. It's really a mind map, but it's a particularly structured mind map. It's a mind map which guides you through answering the sort of key questions that we should be asking, should be answering. First question is why? Why are we here? Why are we proposing to build some software in the first place? So you see on this particular example, this is actually an example taken from the book. This big blue blob is the why. Why are we doing this? It's the business goal. The idea about the business goal is it needs to be measurable. So in this particular example, we want to increase, or we want to get to 1 million players for this particular system. I imagine it's some sort of online gaming platform. So immediately we focused everyone in the room, hopefully we would have assembled people that matter in the room, the strategists, and said, we want to build our user base to 1 million. And that really resonates with people. All of a sudden you get these ears prick up and start saying, actually, yeah, that makes sense, I do want that, I really want that. In the book, Goiko says that it might sound like common sense to know this up front, but from my experience, very few people working on delivery know the actual expected business objectives. Now, it might be worth just sort of taking 2 seconds and thinking to your projects that you're working on. Start asking yourself the question, what is the business goal that I'm trying to achieve? And if your answer is, well, I want to build some software, I want to build this feature, or that system, now imagine you haven't actually got an understanding of the real business goal. So I suggest you go and ask your boss and ask the same question, see if you get the same response, until you get to the CIO, and hopefully he'll give you an answer as to what the real reason we're doing. Building software is not the reason we work. We're here to actually have some actual business outcome. So once we have our business outcome, once we know what we're going to do for this particular phase of work, what we do is we try and identify the people who will be able to influence whether we can achieve this. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of broaden our sort of thought. Rather than thinking about a solution, we're trying to think about all the alternatives. Who can possibly help us get to that 1 million players, or who might hinder us in getting to that 1 million players? So in this particular case, this example, players have been identified as being helpful to meet that goal. Internal users and advertisers can help us meet that goal. So this sounds pretty straightforward at this point. This is the bit that I really like. The next part is to look at the behaviours of those individuals, those types of people, those personas that represent these types of users of your system, or your users who will help us meet that goal. And we'll try and think about ways in which, if we change their behaviour, how can we change their behaviour in order to meet that? So at this point, we're thinking about the business problem, we're thinking about who's involved, we're thinking about behaviours that will help us get to our goal. We haven't talked about software. So at this point, we've still got all the stakeholders, all the senior people in the room, they're still there listening As soon as you start talking about systems and software, they'll drift off and they'll go off and start writing emails. So we haven't started talking about software. So now we've identified behaviours, and these are the sorts of things in this particular example. So players can invite friends. Well, if I'm an existing player on a system, if I invite my friends because I like it, and of course I'm going to help contribute to that one with new players. I can help get to that point by getting my players to start doing some recommendations, maybe posting some information about what they're up to in the game. Internal users and advertisers also we can imagine that if we change the behaviour in a particular way, it might have a particular impact on our business goal. And only then do you start thinking about how you're actually going to support that change behaviour. And those become potentially features. What I love about this as well is it allows us to kind of look back in it. You look for alternatives, you look for potentially cheaper alternatives. People often come with solutions without thinking about all the alternatives. This puts it in your face. You know, maybe actually it's a really quick win that maybe you haven't thought about before. It doesn't enroll right in any software at all. It just might need maybe a little bit of marketing or maybe it's just some word of mouth or something like that. The other thing it does is it allows us to sort of build hypotheses or MVPs. It allows us to say, okay, you know what? I think that by doing something around inviting friends, maybe let's do some incentives. We think are the type of people that we tend to have play our games who will be really good for that sort of stuff. Like we can kind of think that fits in their profile. And maybe we'll start building some features around incentivising other players to join. And we can run a small MVP to see if that works, and we can actually then see whether that's actually had effect on our goal. Maybe we can actually do a little bit, so we can do a little bit up there, and maybe we think that maybe we can do some banner advertising down here, or organise a PR event, and together we can get back in a week or two's time, and we can say, okay, what's the actual impact on that? Has that met our goal? The other thing that you can do by having a really measurable, highly measurable goal is as soon as you've met that goal, as soon as you've done enough and you suddenly met your goal, you just stop. That's it. Done. What you do is open up a new piece of paper and you draw something with a new business goal. Boyko talks in the book about how you can sort of scale this up, because this really sort of represents a sort of a milestone within a bit larger project probably. And there'll be lots of milestones, or there may be lots of projects, and he talks about techniques in which you can use the same sort of thing to sort of scale it out, so you can sort of identify these business objectives and then focus on those. So it's actually really cool. This is one that actually I was quite new to me quite recently. I think it's been around for quite a while actually. It's an opportunity canvas. This particular one was put out by Jess from Story Mapping Panni. And again, it's a similar sort of thing. It's about getting stakeholders, getting decision makers in a room and really understanding the problem they're trying to solve, so we don't just start going down blind alleys and building software without really thinking about it. It's a really useful technique. It just helps you to think of, have you covered all your bases? Have you thought about every single thing that might affect whether this is going to work or not? So you can see boxes, which have got some various concerns inside them, and you can see they're numbered. The basic idea is that you start at number 1, like these things. You can see there are 2 number 1s actually listed here. There's solution ideas and there's problems. The reason there's 2 number 1s is because often people come to us with solutions without giving us problems. That's fine. Chances are within those solutions are actually some pretty good ideas. So we don't want to throw that out and go away, because chances are they get a little bit more than that. So let's stick them on the canvas, and then let's trace it back and say, okay, well next let's define the problems that those are solving. By asking that question, you might find that those solution items actually don't fit within that particular opportunity canvas. Again, a similar approach to impact mapping in that it's maybe a smaller scope of work we're talking about, not necessarily a project, a milestone within a larger project. And then you carry on working through, so you define your customers and your users, you define the solutions that are currently in the market today, you define the value that you think the users are going to get, and really importantly, you define the metrics which you're going to use to see whether you're actually meeting those user objectives. Business problems, obviously, really important. Business metrics, really, really important. Obviously, budget as well, and we have to consider that as well. You can actually read the map in a number of ways, so you can, depending on your audience. So the idea again about doing this is, again, this is a workshop environment. You get people in a room, you're not necessarily talking about really technical details, you're thinking about the opportunity you're trying to achieve, and have available to you as a business, and whether it's worth investing in that opportunity or not. You can read it different ways, so you can start from left to right. It's kind of stuff which is sort of early on in the process to sort of stuff which is recording stuff at the end of the process. So you can start from top to bottom, which are things like users' needs and user concerns versus business concerns, again depending on who your audience is. And you can share this, and hopefully it's pretty clear what it is, and we get a good consensus on whether it's a good idea or not. another really good idea. Give it a go. Give this work.
So, Jess pointed out earlier that the kind of behaviours and techniques that we were looking at from that technical point of view and that business point of view had a commonality of having tight feedback loops. Certainly, pretty sure I said reduce feedback loops in this presentation. Now, if you kind of think about it, the techniques we just talked about from more of that strategic thinking point of view, they all kind of have the similar sort of behaviours. Obviously, MVP is quite explicit. You've got to build, measure, learn. But if techniques like story mapping and impact mapping and opportunity canvas, they're about getting the right people into the room and reducing the feedback loop on their kind of thinking and kind of, I guess, encouraging them to have that sort of scientific mindset and thinking about what it is we should be doing strategically as a business to meet our strategic goals. Now, this diagram here is done by David Joyce, based on some work from Eric Rees, the build, measure, learn feedback loop, funnily enough, because it probably looks quite familiar. Now, we really like it because we think, like, if you're kind of trying to think about this as a behaviour, right, these reduced feedback loops and scientific thinking, and applying it to all, technical, business, strategic levels, then this kind of diagram really resonates with me. So, you start off with some sort of idea or hypothesis or experiment, and you build something, you take some sort of measurement, you get some sort of learning from that measurement, and the really critical part is you make a decision about what to do next based on that learning, and you just keep doing this again and again and again. So, like a product owner has an idea, at the kind of business mindset level of, a feature that they want, they get the team to build it, they measure the effect on real end users, they have some sort of learning about whether they should do something slightly different or continue on to the next part of the feature or just stop because no one's using it. Same thing can be applied to things like continuous integration, same thing can be applied to strategic MVPs, impact mapping, and all that kind of stuff. Now, this concept of applying the scientific thinking and applying tight feedback loops to every kind of level of the business, we think is nicely summed up by the term learning-based culture. And so I guess maybe our suggestion is that as organisations, we should be moving towards a learning-based culture. And we absolutely think that this implicitly includes that we would use our kind of thinking at a strategic level to drive what we do at a business level and what our technical teams do. So, bringing it back to what Jess had at the start, hopefully our development team's technical agility and our business agility will be enablers to allow us to pull this off, drive everything towards the most important thing, which is the business goals.
So just to kind of finish up, this is slide is about a report which Deloitte put out beginning of the year. Every year they do it. They have a tech trends report which they put out about things which are trending, which CIOs kind of listen to and go. This year was about inspiring disruption. The main item of inspiring disruption was this headline, which was CIO as venture capitalist. It's kind of interesting because when you see things published by people like Deloitte, and you know the CIOs will be listening and reading that list of stuff they like, that maybe things are actually starting to move in a slightly different direction. The idea you might have come across before, which really this points to, is the idea that CIOs should be not thinking necessarily in terms of just delivering projects, but actually investing, taking a budget, say they've got 2 million, so don't not necessarily put 500 grand in that particular project, invest in that project, but to think of it as an investment as a whole. How can I get the most value out of that budget that I've been given this particular year? And what he might do is he might say, well, remember that kind of like line I drew earlier when you've got sort of disruptive stuff at the one end and you've got sort of stuff that you do on day-to-day business issues at this end. Maybe as a business organisation you want to invest in a little bit of everything along the way. You've got the high-risk stuff over at that end. Maybe what you want to do is put a small team, a team that's dedicated to that side of things, who are very, very good at the sort of disruptive space and know how to run really good MVPs that may be a little bit risky. Maybe you spin up a new company, maybe you can do something like that to try and protect yourself if that's what you want to do. Maybe you're going to hedge that by investing a little bit on your existing customers and maybe trying to build that customer a little bit more, maybe some stuff in the middle as well. So it's all about investing, it's all about trying to get the most for your money. It's a really interesting concept which I'm reading a lot more about these days, and I think the fact it's sort of hitting the real sort of mainstream stuff is really quite interesting and something to watch out for.
Cool. So, in summary, we think that strategic agility is a lot more value, has a lot more value than technical agility. And, you know, but it's worth keeping in mind that there is, in most organisations, a cultural change required. It's obviously very hard, something to keep in mind. But we think that it's worth it because at the end of the day, what it's going to allow you as an organisation to do is to much more easily yield a competitive advantage against your competition, because your whole company is going to be focused on your strategic goals, so you're going to have a lot less waste, and you're going to be much more easily able to react to changing market trends and that kind of thing. At the end of the day, we believe at least that it's going to lead to a situation that's much more likely where you have a healthy and profitable business. Now, before we end, there's just one other point we want to make, which is that we're very passionate about the stuff that we're talking about today. So there are other people in the audience that are kind of like interested in it and they want to kind of like learn with us or talk to us about it and that kind of thing. Then our contact details are here, and we're more than happy at any point in time to talk about this stuff because we love it. So thank you very much for the chance to talk to you. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we're more than happy to take any questions that you have.
One of the key dependencies in this is for me, the measure phase, measure to learn.
Cool, yeah.
And when with MVP, typically the appetite by businesses to wait for results or wait to feedback scraps, which is what MVP would be, by way of limited feedback based on what you produced in a particular cycle.
Sure.
That appetite is so low that engagement is difficult to get over. So selling that to businesses, is a bit of an ask.
I guess that kind of like wraps up in that cultural change where kind of everyone in the business has to start thinking in that mindset and understanding why having that more scientific mindset and making decisions based on hard data is more, I guess, valuable. Another interesting thing is that often with MVPs, what they kind of suggest is that rather than starting, well, obviously you're always going to start with an idea, but then rather than starting with what am I going to build for that idea, quite often they say start with what you're going to measure. What's the data going to be that you need to make a decision on whatever the outcome is of that idea? Because then you're not thinking about solutions. You kind of start off thinking about that value end, and if you apply it at that small level, it's kind of the similar sort of thinking as like some of the strategic stuff we were looking at with the impact mapping and that kind of thing.
So I think the point is it's easier to finish a project. It's really difficult to actually have make everyone's business change in the organisation, actually make a value difference to the organisation. I think techniques like impact mapping kind of change that, because projects traditionally are all about kind of defining the scope, and you stick to that, or throughout the entire project you don't measure stuff because you don't have to. You finish the project and move on. Whereas impact mapping is all about, well, let's put that at the heart of it, and really you're done when you met your goal. And I don't think pressure is necessarily on the team, or the project team to deliver. It's kind of like, it's more collective. It's kind of like, hey, this is what we want to try and do as an organisation. Let's have a go. Let's try and put every possible idea out there. And let's try it. I mean, what more can you do? As long as you're measuring it, then as you say. But I think those sort of techniques can hopefully break us out of that kind of project mindset,
because they're focused on the bigger picture, which is, look, is it done, and is it all done? They're not
whereas it's kind of like what I was saying, if you kind of focus on time, on budget, that's not the point. The point should be, what are your actual outcomes you're trying to achieve? That's what you should be focusing on. So it's almost like, it's the wrong mindset, I'm not saying it's easy to change that. That's the hardest part, the cultural change. Yeah. Any other questions?
Maybe a comment rather than a question. I'm desperately trying to wrap my brain through a term last thing. I remember having a conversation with Michael Chain, who used to be the CEO of Westham, CEO of the now. But he was talking about Agile. He said, well, we were doing that back in the 1990s, Westham, but we called it, this is where I can't remember the term, something like rational
unified process.
Sorry?
Rational unified process.
No, it wasn't about software. Nothing about unit software. He was talking about as an accounting level. They were using a planning methodology that was about rational
Yeah, that was.
planning.
I'm pretty sure that was rational unified process. process around managing projects in an iterative way. It was kind of like early Agile, but kind of wrapped in a project management.
But the point I was going to make was that the seeds of these ideas, it's not about the cultural change, but trying to impose your own terminology. Maybe you look in the organisation for seeds of that idea, and just be prepared to change the terminology to make the culture change.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And,
so can you explain that? Because I never got it from you what it meant.
Rational compression?
Yeah.
It was basically just a methodology which was like very similar to most stuff we're doing. It's all about iterative development, and it had these different phases. So you had an inception phase, which was all iterative, and you had an elaboration phase, which was all iterative, and then you had a construction phase, and then you had one phase that had like happening. It was brought up. It was sold as like a package solution to iterative delivery, and it wasn't really Agile wasn't a particularly used term back then, but a lot of big businesses bought into that.
It didn't exist right till 2001.
Yeah, but a lot of people, it was really interesting with it because it was very document heavy, and people used to think they had to actually fill in every single document, and it wasn't about that. The idea behind it was to try and tailor it to your organisation, and you just missed the point, but it just died. It's a shame, isn't it? It's actually right.
To your point though, yeah, these ideas, they've been around forever. It's like the Henry Gantt stuff, right? That's like early 1900s. Yeah, like this stuff isn't new, it's just we're not doing it for some reason.
I think the thing to do is try and identify why it's so hard. It really is that sort of like trying to identify why we keep getting it wrong, because it comes down to this common sense. What we always talk about it's simple, but we keep getting it wrong. For the last 100 years, the Henry Gantt was a great one. It's still doing the same stuff, still using its charts in completely the wrong way. In the way that
Kind of like the waterfall thing, right? The report that has waterfall. So don't do this, but we ended up. Yep.
Last question.
You would consider the reasons for getting it wrong because of the factors not good in the management technique. Previous techniques we tried, work, use that again. Previous, that seems good, use that again instead of
Sure. Yeah.
changing techniques.
Management techniques have gotten us quite far over the past 150 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very human nature to keep
Oh no,
to
it's
keep
really-
playing to them.
Look at the fact that it's easy to do. We've got track records. Footsteps forward are very hard to see. Because they're not there.
Yeah, I think definitely some of the maybe opposition that we sometimes come across when we're introducing these kinds of ideas is the way we've been doing it has always worked. What's the point? Whereas we kind of said there's so much waste, and you're kind of focusing on the wrong thing. You need to be focusing on delivering so much better, and owning your competition. And I guess it's different ways.
Dan North did a really good presentation at Yale a couple of years ago. He talked about fear, organisational fear, about people not wanting to push the boundary because they were scared that if they failed, it would reflect badly on them. And I just think that maybe traditional project management techniques kind of just sort of foster that a little bit, kind of feel protected.
It doesn't embrace failure.
Exactly.
Also, if you go out and you tell people they're wrong, they get defensive.
Yeah.
So you need to ask them the questions and they give you the answers.
I've got a question, not for you guys. Can we give these guys a round of applause just quickly?